All right, everyone, let's make our way in. Welcome, everybody, to our, what month is it? October. Can you believe that? It's October already? To our, as my daughter reminded me, Christmas is right around the corner. Welcome to our October meeting. We have a great meeting for you this morning. As you can see, on logistics and industrial and that sort of stuff. I think there's a little event down the road that has recently been funded that I'm sure we'll be talking about today. So look forward to that. Some quick announcements. By the way, my name is Paul Ozzie. I'm your current Georgia Chapter President. And again, thank you for being here. We have our slate of officers for next year that have been nominated. And if you will go onto our website, Georgia Chapter, GeorgiaCCIM.com, excuse me, and you can vote on these. You can vote on the slate. Kirk Rich is nominated to be our president next year. Kevin Brangers is nominated as president-elect, and Andrew Joyner is nominated for secretary-treasurer. So if you will please go on our website and you can vote for those slate of officers. You can also do a write-in if you so choose to do so. Our economic luncheon on December 4th. This is going to be a great event. It's our signature event every year. John Doggett will be our speaker this year. John is a professor of economics and international business from the University of Texas at Austin. I've heard him speak several times before. He is a dynamic speaker. And what he does is he brings in and relates political events, and economic business from the international community, in particular Brazil, India, Russia, China, and how they relate back to the U.S. and how it impacts our economy. It's fascinating stuff. So I really encourage you to sign up for that. That will be December 4th. It's at Cherokee. Space is filling up. We have room for 200 people, and that's it. So please sign up. We do have a couple table sponsorships still available, so look at that. Again, you can go to our website, GeorgiaCCIM.com, and sign up for that. Our annual meeting will be January 13th at Ansley, and this is where we do our officer installation for 2015. We review the year from this year and preview 2015. It's a great event. Spouse-friendly event. It's a dinner at Ansley. We have cocktails, we have dinner, we have a business meeting. It's a really nice event, and that event has really improved over the years, so I encourage you to attend that. Bill Weizenkorn, where's Bill? Is he here? Bill Weizenkorn right there. He, again, will be chairing our sponsorship committee. We're going ahead and putting together our sponsorships for next year. And please contact Bill if you have an interest in sponsoring our chapter for next year. In addition, our 2015 committees are forming. So if you have an interest in being on a committee, we encourage you to do so. Please see Kirk Rich. He's putting together his committees and the committee chairs for next year. So we encourage participation in that. Finally, I'd like to thank our 2014 chapter sponsors. They're listed over here in front of the wall. In particular, our platinum sponsors, Marcus and Millerchap, Ackerman, the Simpson Company, and Kitchens Kelly Gaines. Thank you to all our platinum sponsors and all our silver sponsors that are listed over here. So, without further ado, I'll introduce Pat Murphy with Cassidy Turley. Pat is going to be our moderator today, and he'll go ahead and take the program from here. We'll have our program, hopefully leave 5 minutes or so at the end for Q&A and get you guys out of here by 9 o'clock or very shortly thereafter. So, again, thanks. Thanks, Pat.
Good morning. Hey, everybody's had their coffee. Good. Really pleased to be here today, and this is a great panel of esteemed professionals. I think you're going to get a lot of really good information, so we'll move on. I want to tell you a little bit about the panelists and then some comments about our subject. Starting, moving down from my left, Steve Grable is the Senior Vice President at JLL. He's an expert in leasing, sales, build-to-suits, and has a lot of global supply clients that he's worked with over the years. In the center, you've got Annie Baxter. Annie's with the Global Commerce Division of the Georgia Department of Economic Development. She's the Director of LEAF, which stands for the Logistics, Energy, Agribusiness, and Food Processing, which pretty much does everything, I think. So I don't know what everybody else down there does, but I'm glad to have Annie here. And then David Welch is at the end. David's the Senior Vice President with Weeks Robinson, and he is overseeing the company's very, very large development that everybody's talking about at Gillum Logistics Center here in Atlanta. So that's our panel. We'll get to them in a second. Alexander the Great was reported to have said, "My logisticians are a humorous lot. They know if my campaign fails, they're the first ones I will slay." So that kind of tells you that even in the days of Alexander, logistics was crucial, vitally important, and it remains so today. And with the increasing cost for transportation, for labor, and the ability of local incentives, this step of the process is crucial even before we're looking for the real estate. And those of us in the real estate business prefer to think that the real estate is the most important part of it, but I think we're going to hear today that there are really some factors that you need to be aware of and some resources available to you. So how does Atlanta and how does Georgia measure up in the logistics battle? What trends should we be following as professionals, and what's in our arsenal to try to attract these companies to our projects in our state and city? These are some of the things we'll discuss. We're going to have opening statements from each of the panelists, and then question and answer period. And I know that there's an old adage that one should stop talking before people stop listening, so we're going to move on. All right, first up is Annie Baxter. Annie's going to address some of Georgia's efforts in recruiting logistics-based users and some of the state's resources available to professionals, as well as some other comments. Annie?
Great. Thank you, Pat. So I'm with the Georgia Department of Economic Development, and it is the state's sales and marketing arm. So under the global commerce umbrella, we on the LEAF team are working with all the industries that were mentioned, but specifically logistics. So my team is working to identify companies that are looking to place new warehousing distribution centers in our state and helping to recruit those. So our efforts include going to trade shows, participating in CSCMP, attending RELA, et cetera, and then also partnering very closely with our Georgia Ports Authority as well as we're working with companies. And of course, in the logistics realm, companies are making, you don't have to be a warehousing distribution operation for logistics to be important. So of course, on the manufacturing side, logistics decisions are key as well. So we're working very closely with our Georgia Ports Authority, with the railroads, with Department of Transportation to always answer those questions for companies that we're trying to recruit. But what I would say about Georgia's value proposition really quickly is that, Georgia from a logistics standpoint is uniquely complete. So there are other states that have a port, but our Georgia Ports Authority is the fastest growing and the fourth largest in the U.S. We have Hartsfield-Jackson, which is the busiest airport in the U.S. We have a highway system that is consistently ranked nationally. And then we have the most extensive rail network in the Southeast. So when you look at all of those things, when companies are making logistics decisions, they're usually not just using one aspect of logistics. So that comprehensive platform that we provide for companies and the comprehensive solution we have with the infrastructure that we have in our state is truly a big asset that sets Georgia apart. And that's kind of where we start, and that's where I think before companies even reach us, they have looked at that and identified the fact that the logistics will work for their operation. And so that's part of what we're selling, in addition to the fact that it's our job to work with those in the private sector, real estate professionals and consultants who are bringing these clients to Georgia to help them understand the value proposition also from the cost saving standpoint. So from the incentive side, both state and local, to add that icing on the cake, that other layer of savings and reason for doing business here in Georgia.
If you haven't been to the Georgia Resource Center, they've got some really cool whiz-bang technology that's very helpful to you. All right, next, Steve Grable, after his 10-minute stand-up comedy routine, he's going to share some thoughts on the importance of the Port of Savannah, as well as multimodal operations around Atlanta and Georgia, and perhaps what JLL's clients are doing nationally with respect to the recovering markets.
Obviously, Pat and I have done this before, so we know each other pretty well. JLL is a professional services company, and we do I can't think of anything related to commercial real estate that we're not active in. We're global, headquartered in the U.S., and my background specifically is industrial real estate, and as an industrial broker, I'm on the JLL Logistics and Solutions team, and we have a real strong focus in supply chain. So my comments this morning will be in that perspective. What's really interesting about supply chain that I've learned is when you think about, and let me back up 1 second. I'm going to use the word shippers a lot, and shippers are the companies that are importing in through our ports the goods that essentially are ending up in our retail stores. So Target, for example, I'll refer to as a shipper. So the shippers can be either owner-occupiers or tenants in these large, warehouses. So Home Depot's a shipper, Lowe's is a shipper, so you'll understand that context. And when the shippers evaluate where they're going to locate, either manufacturing for ultimate distribution in the U.S. or warehousing, they're looking first at transportation costs because the supply chain is now global. And all of us in this room, the common denominator is real estate, but the real estate costs are really insignificant given transportation, which is on average 50% of the costs of getting goods to the consumer. Another big bucket, which Annie's really familiar with, will be labor costs. Labor costs can be anywhere from 10 to 15%. Inventory is going to be about 20%. So you can quickly add up all those numbers and you realize that transportation, the cost of maintaining the inventory in the warehouses, and also the labor cost are really what dominates the decisions on site location within logistics. Real estate is typically, on average, less than 5%. Now, I just gave you a description of what happens macro, so I don't want to mislead anybody. When it does come time, when the study of transportation, labor, and the inventory costs are finished, and they do decide that Metro Atlanta is the place to be for southeastern distribution, then of course every shipper gets focused on the real estate costs, and they would like to drive that cost down as much as they can. So it remains competitive once you get into the micro market. But at a large scale, it's those major buckets that determine where companies are going to go, whether Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, or I think at some point we'll be talking a little bit about Mexico and the trend toward nearshoring. Georgia factors in very competitively and very efficiently. Annie's already made the point of our port. We have the fourth most active container port in the entire United States. And that's really significant when you consider that the larger ports that are ahead of us are in population centers that are significantly larger. So Long Beach and LA, for example, are ports number 1 and 2. Well, in addition to the imports coming into those ports, they also have regional population that exceeds the regional population, we have within 1 day's drive of Savannah. Port number 3 is New Jersey, and New Jersey also has a significant local population within 1 day's drive. So for the Georgia Ports Authority to be number 4 in the entire country really is a testament to the efficiency of the port, because if transportation is the number 1 factor, what do the shippers want? The shippers wants the goods coming off the ships efficiently and quickly so they can get them to the warehouses and then ultimately get them to the customers. Earlier this week, how am I doing on the 10 minute? Am I within the 10 minutes? I have one more story. I have one more. Well, this is not a funny story, but it's a good illustration. Earlier this week, I was on a phone call with a shipper, and this was totally non-prompted by me. He's considering a location in the southeast, could be Georgia, and he's been doing some driving around, and he just voluntarily said, I was in this state, which is a state adjacent to Georgia, and he said it was extremely dramatic when I crossed the state line on 2 fronts. One is the number of traffic lanes on the Georgia interstate system, and number 2, the quality of the road construction. And it again emphasized to me that those factors, which might sometimes appear to be insignificant are not insignificant. Those are the things that stand out to companies when it comes to figuring out how they can get their goods by truck, around the Georgia environment and as a distribution hub for the Southeast. The other final point I'll make is our intermodal rail. Both CSX and Norfolk Southern they do have intermodal rail in other locations in the Southeast, but both have built their intermodal rail hubs to centralize in Atlanta. So if a shipper is really looking at intermodal rail, the requirement's probably going to end up in Atlanta. And I'll stop there for the time being.
Thanks, Steve. That leaves David about 25 minutes to. No, David Welch is going to share with us some of his thoughts on activity in Atlanta and some of their experiences at Fort Gillum, Gillum Logistics Center, and what they're seeing in terms of actual users. So this is a good perspective from the owner side.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I got my CCIM designation a long time ago and have been inactive for a while, so it's nice that you all put the letters after my name. So I guess that means I need to pay dues again, right? I'm with Weeks Robinson Properties. We're a privately held Atlanta-based industrial real estate developer. Our kind of marquee development right now is Fort Gillum Logistics Center. That was a 10-plus year process to take it from when it was first announced in BRAC 2005 of closing the base and transition it to the city local development authority. A lot of stories behind that, but it did transfer in June of this year. Simultaneously with that, Kroger purchased 253 acres, and as we talk further today, I'll tell you some kind of unique stories about that, the size and some of their specifications and kind of what they're all about and why they went to Fort Gillum. But it's exciting for Atlanta that you've got a 14-acre site this close in between our perimeter, I-675 and 75, that you can do big box distribution. And as you all know, the markets, it's hard to find that much land close in, that's industrial zone, that's not going to be taken over by another use. And so we can do about 7 million square feet of big box distribution centers. And so the other nice thing is that during that time of getting a transition, we went through our big dip in our market, so we've had some time to really plan things out. We've kind of gone through several different master plans of more mixed use to smaller bay stuff to now back to big box. And I think our timing fortunately has worked out with our market recovering, where we've had 14 straight quarters of positive net absorption. We've absorbed about 30 million square feet during that time. With our base of 600 million square feet, that's taken about 5% off of our vacancy factor, so we're finally back under 10% availability, which is now time to start doing speculative development again. So we've had several projects announced. We're going to kick one off in the spring. And, the last 5 years, the only real construction we've had have been for specific build-to-suits. And Atlanta's been fortunate that we've had a lot of consolidation where companies have taken 2 or 3 locations for economies of scales and efficiency. They've consolidated into larger single facilities. Home Depot's done that a couple different times. Procter & Gamble just did that. And Kroger just did that. They took 3 facilities back into 1. So we're in an exciting time for industrial warehouse distribution type facilities, and the trends we'll talk about today is all primed for Atlanta and Georgia as a whole to be very successful for this next cycle.
Great, thanks. Our standard operating procedure for these moderator gigs is that I've had some softball questions. I'll heave at them. They're going to give you a lot of information, and then you guys get to throw the fastballs at them. So think of some tough questions for them. I want to start from the macro and start with Annie. Let's say we're got a new project in the market, a big project that's looking throughout the Southeast. What's Georgia pitching against, and first of all, who's our competition most likely for a big deal? And what are they pitching? What are we pitching? How do we stack up?
So it'll depend on the sector, but from a distribution standpoint, it has tended to be South Carolina, Tennessee, sometimes Alabama, not as often. For manufacturing, it's going to be South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, maybe even as far west as Mississippi. But our value proposition, you start with the long-term investment in infrastructure in our state. So when you look at what we have, as I mentioned, our assets in the port, in Hartsfield-Jackson, in our highway system, in our rail system, those are things that are very hard to replicate. South Carolina can't go out tomorrow and build an airport that is as busy and connected to the rest of the world as ours is. They don't have a single terminal port that we have. Our port's larger. So there are some of the things that are intrinsic in our infrastructure that set us apart, and I think those are the things that companies are going to look at before they make it to our doorstep. And then you go into labor quality and availability and all of the cost modeling. So as we're typically working with companies, if it's a multi-state deal, they're doing a 10-year P&L to look at all of their costs, all of their taxes, and including logistics to determine where the best location is for this operation. And then in the final aspect of it is you layer in the incentives on top of that. But I always say that incentives don't make a bad deal good. They are the icing on the cake, but you do have to come to the table, and there's a lot of competitiveness among the southeastern states. Another aspect of the Southeast that's helped all of us, and all of our neighbors have this, is right to work. So the fact that we are a right to work state, that has driven a lot of the automotive growth. But our value proposition is, number one, we start with our infrastructure. Then we talk about our tax structure. Our corporate income tax rate has been unchanged since the 60s. Our governor continues to put into place further mechanisms to provide relief to businesses and continues to listen to business. And then labor quality and availability. So we find, two things that are going to be long-term costs for a company, their logistics and then their labor. So that labor cost is really important. And we're finding that companies are even more focused on quality and availability once they pass the cost hurdle. As long as you're competitive, if you look at labor among the southeastern states, it's going to depend on what part of the state of Georgia you're looking in versus what part of your competitor states they're looking at. But as long as you're close, what companies are really concerned with is long-term view of, is your population growing or contracting? What are your educational systems doing to put the programs in place that are going to provide those trained employees? And then finally, Quick Start. So Quick Start training is the state's free training program. An example is Bass Pro, when they went to Middle Georgia, they're near Macon, they needed to train their employees. Well, I'll back up. So Quick Start is offered to companies that are looking at multiple locations, and it's our free training program that is customized to the client's specifications. Quick Start is so highly customized and sophisticated that Kia Automotive used Quick Start and used that in their operation in West Point, Georgia, and then they took that training program and they rolled it out in their plants in Korea. That was how robust that training program was. So to use an example of a warehousing distribution operation, Bass Pro needed to train their employees and their facility was not yet constructed. So Quick Start traveled to Missouri, met with Bass Pro, and learned every aspect of the way Bass Pro does their warehousing distribution operation. They created animation models and basically set up a virtual warehousing distribution center that was modeled after the way Bass Pro specifically does what they do. So they were able to train prior to the facility even being constructed, and then they were able to hit the ground running when the doors open. So that level of capability on the workforce standpoint, the training standpoint, and the fact that that is free and it is so sophisticated and it is so customized is a real tipping point for us with companies as they learn more, because every state has a training program. But again, ours is fully integrated through our technical college system, and it's been in place since the late 60s. So it has been developed over a long period of time. It's hard for another competitor state to go out and replicate that to the level and standard that our training program has been developed. So, and then finally, incentives. So the southeastern states have pretty similar incentives approaches. You're going to be receiving statutory, which means statutory incentives are what a company is going to get just because of what type of industry they are, and they file the forms with their revenue in the state that they're in, and they get those incentives. So they don't have to contact our agency. They don't have to negotiate. These are the things that are standard in place for certain industries, manufacturing, distribution. So for distribution, job tax credits, sales and use tax exemptions on your material handling equipment. Then you also look at what local communities are doing, and each local community has their own approach. and they can do abatements on real and personal property, and then some communities also have the capability to put cash grants on the table. And then finally, the state comes in when there's a single location and we have other competitor locations. The state has the capability to participate using deal closing funds. So those are specifically used to make that final push to win a deal, and they are site specific. So you look at what are the hurdles that need to be overcome at a specific location. And then finally, the Department of Economic Development's role to play is we're supposed to help companies answer all the questions that they have related to labor, incentives, workforce, et cetera, but also to be a liaison with our state agencies. So it's important that we're able to make introductions with EPD to help with permitting on the state side, with Department of Transportation. Often with warehousing distribution operations, you're going to have a lot of trucks going into a particular location. You may have a signalization issue that you need to work through. So that's also another strength where we offer resources, is to liaise with all of our state agencies to make sure we're cutting through the red tape and trying to respond at the speed of business rather than the speed of government, and provide excellent customer service.
Great. And you see why she's so good at what she does. Steve, let's say a shipper has decided that they're going to make a commitment to the Port of Savannah and they're going to start bringing goods in. What influences their decision whether to offload them at a warehouse in Savannah versus maybe Atlanta?
He gave me a tough one. I thought these were going to be softballs. You threw me a hard ball right away.
That's an easy one.
Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to give one anecdote of the airport just in support. I'm going to get to his question, but let me first start with, I think you'll appreciate the anecdote of the airport. I kind of moved that around on you, didn't I? A few years ago, I had the opportunity to represent Nike in a warehouse location in Atlanta. And the decision maker, as you can imagine, was based in Portland, Oregon. And I had been informed that the reason Atlanta was going to be the location was because this particular individual could get a direct flight from Portland to Atlanta. To get to Memphis, he was going to have to, come through Atlanta and then fly to Memphis. So I knew he was going to come to Atlanta. And I was on a conference call with him, and he was explaining what he needed. And it was going to be a significant workforce. And usually when we hear that comment, most of us in the industrial business begin to think about the Northeast. And that's primarily because there is a great variety of housing stock in the Northeast when you're going to have a regional vice president going down to warehouse workers, but a significant sales force too. So I, of course, began talking about all the availabilities in Northeast Metro Atlanta. And I could sense on the phone he was getting increasingly frustrated with me. And as I finished my talk, he said, "Steve, you just don't get it." And of course, at that point, I had visions that he would next be calling my, top competitor, and I had basically blown this deal. So I was smart enough to know I needed to shut up and listen. And he said, "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to fly into Atlanta. I'm going to get in a taxi, and I want to be at my warehouse within 5 minutes." And I said, "Oh. Well, it just so happens that IDI has a new project across the interstate, and I think we can work that out." And he said, "Steve, that sounds good." And that's where they went. And it was all about that airport connection and the ability to get out of Hartsfield and get to the warehouse quickly. So I thought you'd be interested in that illustration of how the airport impacts us in personnel decisions as well as in cargo. Pat's question is a really interesting one. The Panama Canal expansion will be completed by the first quarter of 2016. It's been delayed. And with that expansion, the capacity of cargo coming through the Panama Canal, destined for East Coast ports like Savannah, will triple in size. And the tripling in size is really critical because it lowers the unit of transportation cost. So it's a really big deal. So then the question comes when the ships come in to Savannah, and of course I think everybody's aware that Savannah has received the Army Corps Record of Decision to dredge to 47 feet, and with a tidal influx of between 5 and 6 feet, Savannah will be able to bring in ships requiring on average 50 feet of draft and offload the ships. So Savannah's going to see a lot of that increased cargo. Well, will the warehouses be built in Savannah? Will we see a lot of expansion in Savannah, or will that impact Atlanta? And the answer is it's going to impact both. In my earlier comments, I talked about the population around Southern California, the two ports in Southern California, and the population around the New Jersey port. The population around Savannah doesn't come anywhere near that. So what you see in a port market are two things. You see the large import centers, and examples of that in Savannah are going to be Home Depot, Lowe's, Target at 1.6 million, Home Depot at 1.6 million, very, very large centers. And within the maritime industry, they're referred to as deconsolidation centers. So ships coming from Asia that essentially are bringing plastic pails and nails and all the items that a Home Depot is going to sell to us as consumers are typically originating from different ports in Asia because they're coming from different manufacturing plants in Asia. So those ships come into the Port of Savannah, and those items are going to the deconsolidation centers, such as the one Home Depot already has. And the containers are being opened up, and then they're reconsolidated ultimately into other containers or trailers and trucks, or potentially taken back to intermodal. And those items are then going to the Home Depot regional distribution centers, of which there is one. There's multiple distribution centers for Home Depot in Atlanta. So what you really have is a relationship between the port and then what we are referring to as the inland port. So Atlanta ends up being the inland port for Savannah. And what you will increasingly see is an increase in industrial capacity in Atlanta and throughout the region as we see more cargo coming into the Savannah port. You will see increasing sizes in import centers in Savannah. And as the Georgia coastal population continues to increase, then the local warehousing within the Savannah market for its immediate region is also going to increase. So it's really going to be a factor of all of those things coming together, and we'll see growth in both markets.
That was a great answer.
You like that, huh?
David, there's some big giants in the industry. Obviously, I think Amazon has either started or committed to 18 million feet of build-to-suits across the country in the last 18 months. Walmart's a giant. These 500-pound gorillas, what do they need in terms of building? What are the trends in terms of construction and just from a physical standpoint, what are they asking you to do?
I'll answer that a couple different ways, but just a quick survey. So how many people in the last month have ordered something online from Amazon or Walmart or Home Depot? So most everybody. And I think it's really just kind of take it for granted. You order, it gets there in the next 2 days, and everybody's happy. But if you think about the sophistication and process to make that happen, it's just incredible. And we're throwing around 1 million square foot building here and 1.2 million there, and that kind of goes in one ear out the other. But if you think about the size of that building, so 1 million square foot building is 500 deep by 2,000 square feet long. So if you walk around that, that's a mile. And 1 million square foot building's on about 25 acres within those walls, and an acre is about the size of a football field, so that's 25 football fields within that box. So it's a big, big, big building. And so when you place that order, it's going to go directed to one warehouse, and Amazon has a strategic network around the country that's going to get pinged on where that's going to come from. And they've got to go out and individually pick that one item and then get it directed to your house and get there within 1 to 2 days. So it's a very sophisticated process. And so the typical warehouse that Steve and I grew up leasing over the years was more of a distribution center where it was not hundreds of different items. It was much fewer than that typically, and when they would ship them out, they'd be consolidated in a big pallet, and a truck would take comparable, similar items to 1 or 2 different locations. It was just a much easier sort of logistics model. So these e-commerce buildings, these fulfillment centers are just very sophisticated. They're getting much more automated. So while you have a lot of people that are running around doing things, there's a lot of automation going into them. And then with the number of trucks that has to go out to deliver these things, get to the postal facilities or FedEx or UPS hub, that's a whole different algorithm as well. So the new kind of buildings these folks are looking for on the e-commerce side, the fulfillment side, are 1 million square feet plus, or what this latest trend's been, much bigger truck courts to handle hundreds of trailers. They need storage to have them and stage them to come in and one's coming out. A lot more people, so you have a lot more parking lot facilities, so we need much bigger land areas to put that same building that we used to in the past. The ceiling heights are getting much higher. They're taking advantage of the cube or the higher space. The racking equipment, the handling equipment's getting much more technical and specific. So it's a much more expensive building to build. It takes longer to do, and there's fewer sites that can accommodate that. So the other thing is we're seeing a big change in the floor thickness and how flat they are to handle all this automation equipment. The sprinkler systems get challenged the higher you go. So that's that kind of e-commerce field. On the grocer side, on the Kroger side, something I'd never seen before, but we sold that to Kroger. We're not going to build it for them, but we've been in that process to watch and understand what they're doing. But they'll have a freezer component, a cool component for their produce, and then a dry goods. Well, that dry goods building is going to be 80-foot clear, Steve. I don't know if you knew that or not, but 80 feet. All automated. I can't walk around. It's kind of under a top secret thing because that's a very privatized system to be the leader in the industry. But think about the specification of the floor and the racks to handle that. Just incredible. So a lot of changes. I know this next round of buildings, the next wave will be 36 clear. The kind of old standard was 32, so you can go one more pallet higher. And once you go beyond that, the whole sprinkler fire suppression system starts changing dramatically. So that's about as high as we can go for this next round and kind of still stay within our typical construction standards.
Great. I'm not sure who would be best to answer this, but there's a lot of talk about same-day delivery. And is that going to start creating needs for smaller warehouses in more urban environments? And how does that impact this membership?
Everything that David just said I really agree with. We are in the internet fulfillment industry seeing bigger facilities and consolidation. But we're also seeing the potential and a trend back toward multiple smaller facilities as far as the last mile delivery to the customers. So initially that might sound kind of contradictory, but let me explain it. A couple of weeks ago I had the chance to sit down with Jack Holmes, who is the president for UPS Transportation. And he explained something that I hadn't fully grasped up until that point. In the transportation industry, there's what's called full truckload delivery, and then there's LTL, which is less than full truckload. And what Jack explained is that through the recession and the slow recovery, especially in the Southeast, a lot of the shippers have been able to achieve incredible cost savings in full truckload deliveries. But transportation costs are now going up for a number of reasons. One is we're experiencing a driver shortage, and the new drivers coming into the market really don't want to be long-haul drivers. They don't want to be on the road for weeks at a time. Some of the long-haul drivers will be out for 3 and 4 weeks at a time. And you can imagine the impact on a family, when a driver's gone that long. So the younger group of drivers really prefer to be out no more than 1 or 2 nights, which again feeds into the whole new pattern of intermodal transportation for long haul, with the truckers basically coming in for more short haul drays, and they're maybe out for 1 or 2 nights. So the transportation costs are going up for full truckload delivery. And his feeling, and he says it's already happening, at UPS in terms of how they're responding to their customer needs, is a lot of companies, and again, I'll go back to the retailers like a Target or a Home Depot or a Costco, they're now going back to LTL delivery. So it's less than full truckload, which means there's multiple items on a truck from multiple customers. That's how LTL works, and the LTL costs are going down. That's coupled with the point that Pat just made, is that Amazon's raised the bar, and Amazon is pushing out to consumers same-day delivery, which frankly only happens in a highly urbanized area like San Francisco, New York, or Chicago. I'm not even sure same-day delivery would work in Atlanta. But definitely what's also possible would be next-day delivery, and what a lot of the shippers are more comfortable with is 2-day delivery. But Amazon's raised the bar, and in order to achieve next day delivery, which would be me getting my order in by mid-morning on a Monday, then getting my order by maybe late afternoon on a Tuesday, the only way it's going to work, and we consumers want it to work, is if we have the centers closer to where the customers are going to be located. So another illustration to try to drive that point home is a very large U.S. shipper, Fortune 50 company. We're working with them in Charlotte. They're doing a test case in Charlotte. And this particular company sells large kitchen and household appliances. So in order to make that happen, they're creating a warehouse which is in between the regional distribution center, the larger buildings that David's talking about, and they're referring to it as a delivery center for these items. So instead of the items coming off the showroom floor at the residential location, when you walk in to buy your washing machine, there's going to be this middle facility, which in the Charlotte market is going to be 150,000 square feet. When you get to Chicago, assuming this model works in Charlotte, when it goes to Chicago, it might be 2 or 3 of that size of facility, and it's going to be that interim facility which is in between the large fulfillment center, in between the large regional distribution center, and positioned in order to achieve next day delivery.
That's great. Our time is quickly fleeting, so I want to open it up to questions. I know your questions are much better than the 15 more questions I have, so good.
Steve, as far as cost of transportation, I'm thinking of long-distance trucking versus trains. It seems to me trains, you could use them logistically, are very inexpensive as far as fuel and people, and if the truckers don't want to drive that much, it seems to me, are we shifting more toward trains? I mean, I watched the Port of Savannah sending by train lots of material to Atlanta.
Start repeating the
Yeah,
question first.
Annie and I,
Summarize
I'm
the
sorry,
question.
the question had to do with the relative modes of transportation, particularly trains, and how does intermodal fit in, and is it less expensive and more efficient? And then the final part of the question had to do with the Port of Savannah. Great question. One thing that Annie and I both failed to mention is the Port of Savannah is the only port on the East Coast with dual on-terminal rail connections. That is one reason why the Port of Savannah is the 4th most active port in the United States, because intermodal train delivery is really important, as this gentleman mentioned. Now, the transportation costs will go in increasing cost from all water, so that's the reason why the vessel unit costs are so important, because all water is the least expensive way of getting goods to people or getting goods to port locations. Train travel is the next more expensive but still extremely efficient, and trains are really a green technology. I know in our minds we all think of trains from a century ago with all those black clouds being spewed out. Trains are green technology because trains employ some diesel fuel but a lot of batteries. I mean, what really moves the train are those electric batteries which are recharged. The next higher form of transportation is trucks, and then finally air. So while our airport's really important, shippers aren't using air except for lower weight, high value items that need to get to the consumer quicker than they can get to the consumer. So these transportation modes are really important, and that's why all water and train's critical. Now, there is one critical thing. We are moving into a new transportation model which brings intermodal in. But it is interesting that the intermodal use has declined in 2014. It's been increasing steadily. And really, intermodal is only now about 20% of transportation as compared to 80% for trucks. So trucks still have the winning hand, if you want to use that term, because they're more flexible and the scheduling is easier. And intermodal's having a hard time right now because they're facing competition in train delivery from North Dakota and Nebraska with the shale oil that's trying to get to the Gulf Coast. And the agricultural industry, grain in particular, is really struggling because the cheapest way of getting grain to the export ports from the Midwest is down the Mississippi River. We all know the problems the Mississippi River's been having with lower water volumes. So agriculture, grain in particular, is using rail, and the lobby for agriculture is going to Congress and putting pressure on Congress to make the rail companies pull the intermodal trains over, and the grain trains in particular are getting precedent. Now, what's happening in response for all that, and again, this was Jack Holmes describing the system as he sees it at UPS, is we're getting more train lines built. Ultimately, we will have the Keystone Pipeline, from Nebraska down to the Gulf. So there are a lot of things happening on the infrastructure side which will improve the overall transportation network. And then we do see a rather explosive movement more toward intermodal for domestic transportation of goods. So sorry for the long-winded explanation, but great question. Thank you.
Great. Okay. And
This is going back to the retailers and the shippers. So UPS got slammed last year at Christmas. How are the landlords and the shippers and Amazon kind of addressing the flexibility and short-term leases? And is there some things being worked out?
I'll answer briefly, and then, Annie and David may have their perspective. That was the context of the whole conversation we were having with UPS a couple of weeks ago, and that's why they're so sensitive in terms of the transportation systems. Their answer is the public needs to be informed that, next day delivery is just basically impossible. Next day delivery is possible, but within a certain, constraints. And what's really hurting them is this shortage of truck drivers for long haul, and that's why they're feeling we've got to have a more proficient intermodal system, and why, in his opinion, the shippers are going to be going back to also multiple smaller warehouses to be able then to get stuff quicker to the consumers. But I don't know, David, you may be seeing in some of your requirements too.
Well, particularly in Atlanta, as the market's getting more leased up, there may be less of opportunities. But over the last 5 years, very common to have short-term leases. Landlords kind of looked forward to that. They kind of expected it, really from kind of September forward, because you get the Halloween groups coming in doing their short-term, and then the whole Christmas crowd. So I think that will continue. And again, they don't have to have the modern, sophisticated warehouses for these short-term crunches. And Pat, I know your group probably has a lot of requirements on that. So I think that will continue to be a trend, and it works for both parties real well.
And one of the benefits of those short-term leases is, as Dave said, they can take buildings that are not new and 32 clear. They can take some of our older property, which would otherwise be considered really functionally obsolete, and use that for short-term. And those owners are usually very, very happy to have them. Okay, another question? I'll throw one more out. Annie, we've talked about all the great things that Georgia has to sell and Atlanta has to sell. What's your response when you hear the criticisms like that Tennessee and Florida have no state income tax and that Atlanta's traffic is unbearable? How do you counter those? You just change the subject?
Yeah, I'd come up with a joke and distract. No, actually, so, if you look at, you can make that point that Florida and Tennessee have no income tax, but you're also making that statement in a vacuum. So you can't really look at that without looking at all your landed costs. And that goes back to our value proposition of, because, we all know that the taxes are coming somewhere. They're just structured differently. So we try to do the best job we can of communicating, and also we spend a lot of time in research understanding what our competitors are doing. Right, and so we're ready to combat those statements when they come, and so you go back to, well, no state income tax, yes, but here's our comparison in corporate income tax rate. Here's our structure for being a single factor apportionment for taxes, which is also very beneficial. So you have to look at all the different taxing mechanisms, not just one in a vacuum, and we're usually pretty good at showing how we are competitive and can back that up with data. And then with traffic, by the time we're working with someone, they have identified that, companies realize that population centers have traffic, right? So if you're going to a city, a metropolitan area, you will have traffic. And we frankly don't as often encounter that on the industrial side, questions about traffic. Now, I'm not on the corporate solutions side, so our corporate solutions team would be answering those questions a lot more often than I would, so I'll make that statement first. But by the time we're working with a company, they've already understood what the value proposition is, and we're not often getting that many questions about traffic as it's related to trucking for the industrial side.
Great. David, spec construction, yes, no? What's the outlook for 14 and 15 and beyond?
It's coming. I'm tracking about 3 million square feet of spec construction that either started or has just begun to start, and then we're tracking another 9 to 10 planned buildings. And these are all, I'm tracking 500,000 square feet on up, just because that's what we're looking at. So we're going to see a nice new wave of new construction. We hope they're spread out so they don't all hit at one time and have a nice measured absorption and don't get too far ahead of ourselves.
Great. Once again, anybody? Okay.
Real example, we talked about the Under Armour deal to Tennessee, and I assume that Georgia was on the short list, and how they made their decision to go to Tennessee.
Repeat the question, too. The question was about the Under Armour deal.
So I'll make one comment related to, so we pursued that project very aggressively. Actually, Steve and I both were involved in that project, and it was very important to our port and to the state and to the governor. It turned out that it's hard to overcome, so logistics played a role in it. This was intended to be a national distribution center rather than regional, so therefore we were a little bit too far east. We had a very aggressive incentives package, but we weren't able to overcome transportation penalties, which again are long-term, because this was intended to be national in scope rather than regional. That put us at a little bit of a disadvantage from a cost standpoint for long-term viability. Steve, what would you like to add?
Well, Annie's very humble and modest. She did a phenomenal job. I really thought that facility was going to come to Georgia. My team was responsible for the Georgia location. So I can assure everybody the state of Georgia and the Port of Savannah went all out to win that significant 1 million expandable to 2 million square foot facility, which is going to go to Tennessee. Annie is completely correct. What happened in the process is, rather than Under Armour thinking of the site as a southeastern distribution center, and when shippers think that way, the requirement typically does come to Georgia. They began to think of this location as their largest distribution center nationally, and from Nashville, which is where the center is going to be located, you can reach 70% of the U.S. population 2-day ground transport. And that's really significant. So from Nashville, you can get all the way down to Miami, and you can get much further west. So what Under Armour is ending up with is a 3 DC model. They're already in Southern California. They do a tremendous amount of importing through Long Beach. They're already in Baltimore, which is where they're headquartered, so that's their northeastern location. And then essentially Nashville is going to cover the rest of the country. And we're real strong in logistics, but from Atlanta, you just can't make that same claim that we hit 70% of the U.S. population within 2 days. So it really was that's why I've been emphasizing transportation. We made a great run. The state did a great job, but unfortunately it was a transportation logistics decision.
Yeah, I noticed, I was reading the National Business Journal, and the state of Tennessee came up with $6.5 million just cash laid on the table. I mean, does Georgia do that type of incentive?
That was what was left over from Phil Fulmer's contract. So.
Yes, so when I was referring to the deal closing funds earlier, that's our pot to pull from to try to make that last final pass. But Tennessee has gotten really aggressive recently on the cash side. But Georgia is also very, very competitive, and we were very competitive in this deal as well.
Okay.
Dave, you made mention of the October deal earlier, and early on, all the preceded over down the industrial deal. How did that deal end up in your
Question. It was, and we were trying to stay below the radar and not getting all the media, and that was a 2.5-year process of having them come here. So, we keep using transportation costs. That's what drove that deal. We had a little bit of an advantage being in our location because they were doing stuff south as well as around. So we had a little bit better claim there. They also wanted to own their facility, and the other location I looked at was going to be a long-term lease at Charlie Brown Airport, and so that really weighed in our favor as well. And I'll brag on Annie and her department as well. They were very involved with the Kroger deal very early on, and lots of different, the Quick Start program we talked about. There's transportation with traffic lights. We kind of even got down to that level with the Department of Transportation, providing extra incentive and extra funds to attract them to stay here. And they were heavily looking at Tennessee and South Carolina as well. So we won our share of those deals. We lost Under Armour, but we're fortunate to keep Kroger.
Okay, we're basically out of time. You've heard from a great panel of experts, and a testament to their expertise is that they gave you all this information with virtually no preparation whatsoever. So please give a round of applause to our panel.